This video will introduce some basic concepts related to community ecology. And so to begin, let's just describe what we mean by a community. We're talking about all of the organisms of different species that live together and interact with each other in a particular area, essentially at the same time. So for example, you can go out to the prairie near Grand Forks here, and you tend to find very distinct assemblages of species that live together within a particular community. So before we talk about all the interactions that can occur among all of the different organisms out in nature, let's begin by asking the basic question, what role do organisms play in their environment? And this introduces the concept of an ecological niche. So an ecological niche, this refers to the role that an organism plays out in the environment, and includes things like where the particular species lives, what it feeds upon, and what uses it as a source of food. So in general, an ecological niche refers to the role that an organism plays out in the environment. And we can distinguish between the fundamental niche of a species as well as the realized niche of a species. So the fundamental ecological niche of a species, this is sort of the theoretically possible ecological niche. So this would refer to a situation where there are no constraints, no predation, unlimited food sources, and so forth. This would be the fundamental niche of an organism. Typically, of course, those conditions don't exist for any species out in nature. So instead, what we refer to as the realized niche. This incorporates all the constraints, competition, and so forth that species have to deal with. And so the realized niche refers to the actual ecological niche that we tend to find for various species out in nature. If you can think about all of the interactions that species have with each other, there are lots of things going on. So for example, lots of competition between different species, competing for various resources and food and so forth. Let's introduce this basic concept of the competitive exclusion principle. Simply stated, this refers to the idea that two or more species with the exact same ecological niche cannot coexist in nature. So if you have two species that have the exact same requirements, they just can't coexist. One will tend to survive, the other will not. So this concept is illustrated in these simple experiments that were done. We're looking at various species of paramecia, so these small protists growing in culture. If you look toward the top panel, if you grow these three species separately, of course they grow just fine. They exhibit logistic growth, they stabilize near the carrying capacity. But what happens when you grow two species in the same environment? Well, what we see in the lower left here, what we see is that one species can survive, the other cannot. So here we had these two paramecia with the exact same ecological niche, the exact same feeding behaviors and so forth. One outcompeted the other. Toward the right, we see a situation where one of those species was able to adapt and modify its niche, modify its feeding behavior, so that even though it displayed lower population numbers, it was still able to coexist with this other species, again by modifying its niche within its environment. So again, just illustrating the basic concept of the competitive exclusion principle. Again, namely, two species cannot coexist if they have the exact same niche in natural conditions. So imagine all the interactions that are going on between different species. Again, you've got competition. If you're a plant, it could be competing for light, for soil nutrients. If you're an animal, you could be competing for food, for nesting areas, for mates, and so forth. There are obviously lots of ways that organisms can defend themselves, prevent them from being eaten. So plants, they have lots of physical defense mechanisms, thorns like we see toward the left. On the right, this is an image of these needle-like crystals produced in the leaves of many types of plants that prevent many plants from being eaten by various herbivores. Animals, of course, have various ways of defending themselves as well. Some animals are camouflaged, like we see here. Other animals take the opposite approach, like the frog we see toward the left, basically advertising by their bright colors that they are toxic or at least non-palatable. They don't taste good to most other animals. What we see on the right is essentially a bird eating a monarch butterfly. Notice that as soon as the bird eats the monarch butterfly, the bird tends to spit it back up. Well, it turns out that monarch butterflies taste horrible to other animals. So other species of butterflies sort of take advantage of this by essentially mimicking monarch butterflies. So let's introduce the concept of mimicry. So mimicry, again, this is the situation where you have one species mimicking. It can be by physical appearance. It could be by other attributes as well, but one species mimicking some other species. We can distinguish between Batesian and Müllerian mimicry. Batesian mimicry, this is a situation where you have perfectly harmless species that are mimicking otherwise harmful or unpalatable species. So again, that's Batesian mimicry. In contrast, Müllerian mimicry, that's a situation where you have many species that are harmful in some way, where they tend to resemble each other. The idea is there are strengths in numbers. So let's illustrate these two concepts. So first of all, Batesian mimicry. Think back to the monarch butterfly situation. Toward the top, we see a picture of a monarch butterfly. Toward the bottom, we see a picture of a viceroy butterfly. Now, if a bird were to eat this viceroy butterfly, it would taste perfectly fine. Would the bird have no problem with it? But is this viceroy butterfly likely to be eaten by a bird? Well, no, because notice it's mimicking the monarch. And birds that have eaten monarchs, they have learned that they taste horrible, so they're therefore unlikely to eat other butterflies that look similar. So again, this is illustrating Batesian mimicry, an otherwise perfectly harmless species mimicking an unpalatable species. The same idea illustrated here. So here we have, toward the bottom we have a moth, a beetle, and a hoverfly. Again, these are perfectly harmless, but notice they mimic harmful species. They look like bees and wasps. So again, these they look like they might sting you, but they really can't. Müllerian mimicry illustrated toward the top. So wasps, bumblebees, honeybees, they all resemble each other. Different species, but they're all harmful in some way. They can all sting, but again, they tend to take on the same appearance. So again, this represents an example of Müllerian mimicry. A few more concepts. First of all, this idea of keystone species. There are certain species that exist in communities that play a key role in maintaining biodiversity, this idea of a keystone species. So to illustrate that concept, let's take a look at this starfish. Scientific name of the starfish is Pisaster. But what role does this little starfish play in maintaining species diversity? Well, if you go out to tide pools in certain regions, you're going to see that you might have some starfish, some sea anemones, lots of algae and so forth growing on the rocks, all sorts of species living together in those communities. But what happens if you remove just one species? What happens if you just remove the starfish from this community? Well, it turns out that if you look at the bottom image here, this was an experiment that was done over the course of several years. Within a few years, after the starfish was removed from the community, notice number of species dropped off dramatically. Why is that? Well, essentially what happened when you remove the starfish, those tide pools started to look like this. Mussels, clams, they take over the area and prevent all of the other species, the sea anemones, the algae and so forth, prevent them from living in that area. So essentially by removing this top-level predator, that allowed another species to sort of take over, and again, ultimately, that caused a significant decrease in biodiversity in those communities. So again, this just illustrates the importance that these starfish, these Pisaster, play as a keystone species in these communities. The final concept that we'll address deals with the number of species that we tend to find on islands. So species richness on islands. There's this so-called equilibrium model of island biogeography that essentially tries to explain and sort of predict and model the number of species that we tend to find on islands. Now, if you think about islands, you might think about small patches of land out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and that's fine. Those are certainly islands. But there are other ways to think about islands as well. But nevertheless, for now, let's just think about Islands in terms of patches of land out in the ocean somewhere. So the equilibrium model of island biogeography. This idea essentially states that there are some fundamental factors that determine the number of species that we find on islands. So for example, if you just think about this intuitively, this should make some sense. The idea is if you are a large island, you're probably going to have more species than if you're a small island. The idea is there's just more habitat available. So large islands might tend to have more species than small islands. And also, the closer an island is to a mainland, the more species it's likely to have as well. And why is that? Well, the idea is that species that colonize islands typically are going to come from some mainland. So the idea is the closer an island is to mainland, the more likely it is that new species will arrive on the island. So take a look at the image here. What this is illustrating a few concepts. So first of all, if we look at the blue lines here, what these represent is how close an island is to a mainland. The idea is the closer an island is to a mainland, the more likely it is that new species will colonize that island. So this top blue line, that's an island near the mainland. This lower blue line, of course, that's one farther away. The red lines indicate extinction rates. The idea is smaller islands are going to tend to have higher extinction rates than larger islands. So if you put all these together, the idea is you can come, if you see where these lines intersect, you can come up with these equilibrium number of species. So on the far left right here, we see this black dot. Again, just think about this intuitively. What we see is that if you're a small island that is far away from the mainland, we're probably going to have more species, you're probably going to have fewer species than if you are a large island that's close to the mainland. So where these lines intersect, that predicts the relative number of species that can be maintained on islands. So if you put this all together and then you actually look at islands that actually exist and you look at number of species of birds and plants and so forth, what you see is that quite often the actual data do indeed fit the predictions made by the equilibrium model of island biogeography. So that concludes our basic discussion of community ecology.